Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, What to Expect on Your First PJR Audit. My name is Shannon Craddock and I'm the Programs and Accreditations Manager here at PJR. And I am pleased to present today's topic. I think it's a very important one, and I feel that knowledge is power, and having a good understanding of what's going to happen during an audit can alleviate any worries or concerns as you begin the process. I'd like to remind everyone that all participants have been muted to ensure sound quality. If you have any questions, please type them into the question feature of the GoToWebinar, and I'll answer as many of these as possible at the conclusion of today's prepared presentation. Also, a recording of today's presentation, along with a copy of the slides, will be available to download within 24 to 48 hours at the conclusion of today's webinar. So today we're going to cover the various stages of the life cycle of the audit process, the quotation stage, what happens before the stage 1 audit, the initial audit itself, if there's a need for a revisit, what you need to do after the auditor leaves, how your certificate gets issued, and then the surveillance mode. So let's begin with the quotation stage. Our application form, which is part of our F1 series of documents, is admittedly complex. However, the more information that we gather about an applicant, the more competitive, strategic, specific our quote is first time through. So your honest and detailed responses on this form may alert us to any potential logistical readiness issues or challenges. And if we know about these up front, we can avoid costly changes to the audit later on. For example, I'm dealing with a client right now who just completed their stage 1 audit, and on their application, they failed to tell us that there's a second site. Travel has already been booked for this audit, and we need to add time to accommodate for the second site, as well as an employee count increase. And it's creating an additional cost for the client, scrambling for the auditors to change their calendars to squeeze the extra day in, which could have been avoided from the beginning. How do we quote? With some exceptions for some specialized standards, we follow the International Accreditation Forum's mandatory document number 5. And it spells out the days that we have to quote based on certain risk levels. The maximum discount that we can give is 30%. And we may also be required to add audit time depending on the situation. And this document is available for download at www.iaf.nu. You're going to want to watch for competitive quotes that exceed this 30% discount. They're most likely coming from certification bodies that are not accredited. PJR certainly hopes you'll sign a contract with us, and after that happens, you'll be assigned to what's officially known as an Audit Program Coordinator. You may refer to this person as your scheduler, who will service any needs that you have. They provide cradle-to-grave client management. Schedulers do their best to assign an auditor that is qualified in your standard, so an aerospace auditor to an aerospace client, a medical device auditor to a medical device audit, obviously, but also competent in the client's technical area. So there may be an automotive auditor who specializes in plastics. That type of auditor would not be assigned to you if you're an automotive metal stamper. We would assign an automotive auditor who's competent in metals and stamping. And of course, in order to minimize travel for our auditors and costs for our clients, we always try to assign someone who is in a geographically friendly location. Schedulers will send you a form. It's part of our F108 series of documents. That's really an attestation of readiness for your audit. So it's a simple yes/no check sheet. that we ask you questions. Do you have this? Is this prepared? Have you done this activity? Have you done an internal audit? Have you done a management review? And that's really a check for you to make sure that you're ready. Most certainly audits are very costly, so we don't want you to proceed unless the pillars of the management system are in place. So a little bit more about this F108 series of documents. It requires your organization to attest to your readiness for the stage 1, as I previously mentioned. We typically require you to submit the scope and exclusions of your management system. Our auditors need to know what it is you're certifying: the design and manufacture of plastic molded parts, the provision of temporary staffing services, etc. And then a description of your process interactions. This is required by the standard. We need to know what your identified processes are and how they link together. And of course, in ISO 9001 2015 based standards, there's a lot of emphasis on the organization's effective management of processes that are outsourced. So you want to make sure that this description of process interactions includes outsourced processes. So if, for example, you outsource heat treating or plating or some type of testing, when we look at this description of process interactions, the second bullet point here, that should be really obvious that there's an outsourced process just by looking at that document. In some cases, for some standards, we may also require you to submit a list of your process measurables, sometimes referred to as KPIs, and associated performance against those indicators. PJR Form F191, optional but highly recommended. Internal audit documentation, internal auditor competency records, and management review records. I'm a big fan of PJR Form F191. It's optional but highly recommended, as the bullet says. But it's a good check for you that your identified processes are in fact meeting all the requirements of the standard. Once you submit this form and any supporting evidence that we may request, we have someone at headquarters review your responses and see if there's any low-hanging fruit or any concerns that kind of leap up off the page at us. And we'll alert you, hey, we're seeing that there's a second building on your description of process interactions, but we don't have a second building contracted. Or we're not seeing that you've done an internal audit, or your management review seems to be very sparse. We will provide you some initial feedback. We want to see you succeed. Nothing makes us happier than for a client to have a successful audit. Keep in mind, however, this is a cursory review. This is not your stage 1 audit, so not all potential nonconformities or concerns will be identified. Stage 1 audits are typically conducted on site, and I highly recommend this. On occasion, we do off-site stage 1 audits for 9001 management systems, but I'm not a fan of this type of arrangement. Number one, you lose that interaction with the auditor. There's a high likelihood that the auditor is going to see something on the stage 1 pointed out to you. You can fix it prior to the stage 2. And it prevents any surprises on the stage 2, a hidden building that you didn't tell us about, some logistical concerns that may result in increased costs later on. The stage 1 audit is largely a document review to ensure readiness and to ensure effective planning for the stage 2. And whether it's conducted on-site or off-site, there's always a formal opening and closing meeting. So let's talk about some common stage 1 issues. So in pulling this presentation together, I looked at a lot of stage 1 audit results from many different types of clients, and some themes emerged. And I want to share these with you so you can potentially prevent this from happening in your management system. Really common is that a client has an inadequate or inappropriate interaction of process description. One that resembles the Plan, Do, Check, Act diagram from the standard. A canned one that they get from a consultant that consultant uses for all of its clients. Your organization really needs to be documenting an interaction that's unique to your organization, using the process names that are used in your organization every day and have been used for years. Your interaction of processes, a seasoned auditor can look at that and tell right away whether or not you seem to understand the process approach prescribed in ISO 9001. It's very, very obvious to our auditors if you understand this process approach concept just by looking at that single piece of paper. Second most common failure is inadequate process measurables or process performance data. Clause 441C of ISO 9001 requires your organization to determine and apply the criteria and methods, including monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators. So every process on your interaction needs to be monitored or measured, and there needs to be performance data available to prove this monitoring and measurement. Some standards, such as the automotive standard, have minimum requirements for the amount of data that has to be available. IATF 16949 prescribes 12 months, for example. But for other standards, there sometimes just has to be enough evidence to show the auditor that your monitoring and measuring process is working and you're reacting to those data appropriately. So to tie the first two common stage 1 failures together, first, determine what your processes are and document their interaction. Second, for the processes that you've determined, if there's 6 of them or 16, doesn't matter, but for every process that's determined, you need to either be measuring, ideally, if it's possible, or monitoring that process. Another common stage 1 failure is an inadequate internal audit. Typically, when we evaluate an internal audit, we're looking for a complete set of records, including a schedule, a plan for the individual activity, notes or some type of report to show that all requirements were audited. What we typically see is that notes of conformity are often lacking. And sometimes an organization only keeps records of non-conformities. But chances are there are many areas of your system that don't have any non-conformities. And if you don't keep records of the conforming evidence you saw, how can you prove that they were audited? And then any corrective actions to address the identified non-conformities. Make sure auditors aren't auditing their own work. So if you have a single internal auditor, chances are that person is auditing their own work. For some standards, we do allow the stage 1 to be conducted before you complete the internal audit. I don't think this is to your best advantage, however. You lose the benefit of getting feedback on your internal audit process prior to the stage 2. Our auditors will still confirm that there's a process or a plan in place to get the audit completed prior to the stage 2. Another common stage 1 failure is internal auditor competency records. Fancy training certificates for a 3 to 5 day class that you spend thousands of dollars for are not enough, and they may not even be necessary. What we need to see is that you've identified what the competency requirements for your internal auditors are, and then show evidence that your auditors meet these requirements. And they can meet these requirements in a lot of different ways other than a fancy, expensive outside training course. For some standards, IATF 16949 in particular, the requirements for internal auditor competency are significant. And I encourage you to consult the standard and customer-specific requirements regarding these. The other common stage 1 failure is management review. Your records need to clearly show that all inputs and outputs were addressed. When I audit management review, I often see that an organization presents me with PowerPoint slides And that's great, but I also need to see minutes or evidence of what was discussed. So records of the results of the discussions of these slides. So in between the stage 1 and stage 2, there's typically, I would say 60 to 75 days, minimum of 30 days. Keep in mind that we have a 21-day cancellation policy. So if the stage 1 doesn't go well and your stage 2 is scheduled within 21 days, you're automatically going to get charged half for canceling that stage 2, which can be costly. Also, within 21 days, the auditor's travel has been booked, so you'll be responsible for those change fees as well. Do yourself a favor, keep a nice window in between the stage 1 and stage 2. I get a lot of requests for back-to-back audits, and I can't think of a single instance where that has been successful. Don't do it, folks. Use this time to address any potential nonconformities or areas of concern that were identified by your auditor in their stage 1 report. If you fail to do so, this could result in major nonconformities at your stage 2. So moving on to the stage 2 audit, you will receive an audit plan in advance of the audit. Just like the stage 1, it starts with an opening meeting. Trust me when I say that our auditors notice who is present. They want to make sure that top management is there, communicating their commitment to the operation of the management system. The audit is then conducted in accordance with the audit plan using the process approach, auditing your identified processes, whether there are 6, 16, 3, 37, however many processes you've identified. We'll want to understand what is the process, who is the owner. We're going to ask the owner, how do you know how the process is doing? They should be able to talk about the performance of the process against the identified objective and target or monitoring criteria. And then they should be able to talk about what happens when that target isn't met. After we have the answers to these questions, the auditor will then make sure that the anecdote told to them is in fact happening in practice. So we'll verify what we were told. We do this by looking at completed documents and records, interviewing the people other than the process owner who actually do the work, and observing people doing their job. Just like in the stage 1 audit, we'll do a closing meeting for the lead auditor to present their results and recommendation to our executive committee, which is our decision-making body. Remember, the lead auditor does not get to decide if you're certified or not. They make a recommendation in their report, and a separate individual, a member of our executive committee, makes the decision. Before the auditor leaves, they have to leave a copy of any nonconformity reports with you. If they don't, you should be calling the PJR office immediately. This is very important. You also should be getting an audit report within about a week of the audit, if in fact the auditor doesn't leave it when they leave your site. Some auditors try to do that. Again, call the office if you're not getting these documents. I always analogize the decision-making process to taking a Blue Book exam in college. That lead auditor wants to fill that audit report with enough evidence to convince the decision maker, very similar to a university professor, whether or not you should be certified. So that report needs to include a lot of detail. It's our expectation that every single nonconformity needs to be documented as such. Failure for our auditors to do this leads to you just applying Band-Aids or quick fixes to problems. And we all know that often that problem recurs. And I'm a firm believer that consistency is the key to client satisfaction. If you know that no matter who's coming in to audit your system, you're going to get the same results, you're going to be much happier. There'll be no surprises. And the only way we we get that is if every auditor does the right thing every time. And if a finding exists, they have to write it up. Now, that being said, I said in an earlier slide, we want to see you succeed. So if an auditor thinks they have a nonconformity, they're going to communicate it to you as quickly as possible. It may be that they're interviewing the wrong person. They're asking questions in a way the auditee doesn't understand. Our auditors speak ISO 9001. Your organization may speak an entirely different language. You may not understand the question. We will truly make sure that there is no evidence of conformity and we're not just misunderstanding or having a communication gap before the decision is made to write a finding. But if a finding truly exists, our auditors need to write it up. Common stage 2 failures, and I've cited the relevant 9001 clause. Keep in mind there may be different clauses for other standards, 14001 or 13485, for example. Failure to determine the necessary competence for employees, 72A. Inadequate records of supplier evaluation and reevaluation, 841. Inadequate corrective actions, root cause analysis, 102. Document control issues, and calibration. Okay. Revisit audits may be needed. They're typically done on site when a number of nonconformities or serious nonconformities, known as major nonconformities, are documented. Adequate preparation and sufficient time between the stage 1 and stage 2 minimizes the likelihood of major nonconformities and the need for a costly revisit. So after the auditor leaves your site, they don't leave a copy of the audit report. I already mentioned that you should get a copy of that audit report within 7 days. Before the auditor leaves your building, however, they need to, at minimum, leave you with a copy of the nonconformities. You then get 60 days to address any nonconformities. There are some sectors, aerospace comes to mind, that require responses more quickly. When you're replying to nonconformities, keep in mind that we require containment as applicable, correction, root cause analysis, and corrective action. For major nonconformities, we require full evidence of implementation of the corrective action. For minors, we can accept a plan with target dates in the future. Keep in mind that some standards, automotive and aerospace in particular, require that all findings be closed before any type of certificate is issued. So target dates for corrective action reaching into the future will not be accepted. PJR does offer a webinar on problem solving. It's entitled Root Cause Analysis and Systemic Corrective Action. I encourage you to check this out. It can also be applied to your internal problem solving or dealing with complaints for your customers. Take your time with the problem solving process and use a multidisciplinary approach. These techniques will ensure your responses are accepted first time through. After the lead auditor accepts your corrective action responses, the entire report, along with your corrective actions, are forwarded to our executive committee or decision-making body. There has to be copious evidence to convince the reviewer that the lead auditor's recommendation, either to certify or not to certify, is the appropriate one. So if the auditor is recommending certification, that reviewer is going to expect to see lots of evidence that you were conforming to the requirements of the standard. Clear conclusions regarding process effectiveness. Your processes were meeting the identified targets, or if they weren't, you were taking actions to bring those processes to where you want them to be. Nonconformities almost always exist. That's fine. It doesn't prevent you from being certified, but you will only get certified if there are good responses to convince the reviewer that the issues will not recur. You've implemented a containment as needed, correction, done a root cause analysis, and taken corrective action to eliminate that root cause. If the executive committee reviewer concurs with the lead auditor's recommendation to certify, then a certificate's issued. The date, the effective date on the certificate is the date that decision's made. It's not the last day of the audit. And that certificate is good for 3 years. It will include the scope of what was certified, for example, design and manufacture of plastic molded parts, no more, no less. So if you aren't manufacturing picture frames, your certificate won't speak to that. If you're only manufacturing picture frames, those are the exact words that will appear in your certificate scope. When you receive a copy of your certificate, you'll also get a copy of our Pro 3, which is a procedure that outlines the requirements for proper use and advertising, marketing of your certificate, as well as how you need to use PJR's registration symbol and the symbols of our accreditation bodies. When you're advertising your certification, you need to be careful that you advertise only the activities and sites that are certified, and do not mislead any end users of your certification. So getting certified is actually the easy part. Maintaining the certification is more difficult. Surveillance audits are conducted once a year, and less commonly every 6 months. Annual surveillance audits, tend to be more cost effective. If your system is weak or we see evidence that you're struggling, we may require you to amend your contract to have semi-annual surveillance audits. Actually, I'd like to point out that there is an error in the next bullet point. I'm sorry about that. The requirements have changed since I last delivered this presentation. The due date for your first surveillance audit is in fact determined from the certification effective date. And that first annual surveillance audit after your stage 2 audit has to be conducted within 1 year from when your certificate is issued. That will be corrected before it is uploaded. These surveillance audits are shorter in duration than the initial audit, about 1/3 the initial audit time. Requirements are sampled using a risk-based approach. What does that mean? Well, if you struggled in the audit of, for example, the purchasing requirements or the supplier evaluation or document control, those areas will most certainly be audited on the first surveillance. Activities, processes related to the management review, internal audit, and corrective action requirements are covered on every audit. And at the end of the 3-year certificate cycle, we do a recertification audit for 2/3 the initial audit time, where again, we cover all the requirements. And that is all for today's prepared presentation. I will now answer any questions that anyone has about this presentation or any other questions pertaining to PJR. Again, as all participants have been muted to ensure sound quality, please feel free to type these into the question feature. Bruce, the webinar is in fact being recorded. It'll be available for download from www.pjr.com, and you'll be able to get a copy of the slides and a recording. Getting a couple requests to repeat some of the beginning slides out of courtesy for folks that did attend the entire time. I'm not going to do that, but again, a digital recording will be available of the entire presentation. www.pjr.com is where you go to access a copy of the slides and the recording. On the right-hand side of our homepage, go to upcoming and previously recorded webinars, and you can access them there. Someone is asking, do you need a hard copy of the manual? Documented information can be retained electronic or hard copy. I'm not sure specifically what is meant by manual. In ISO 9001 2015, there's no longer a requirement for a quality manual per se, although some other standards still require this. But any type of documented information can be hard copy or electronic. Great question. Can you recommend any saved PJR webinars that would qualify an internal auditor's competence requirements? So I think this is a great way, Alan, to demonstrate and make sure what everybody's on the same page regarding competence. So you need to determine what the competency requirements are for your internal auditors. Here are some good ones. An understanding of the standard to be audited, an understanding of good audit technique, interviewing, reviewing documents and records, drawing conclusions, compiling an audit report, facilitating an opening and closing meeting, being open, flexible, tenacious. All of those are good competency requirements for an internal auditor. Some saved PJR webinars can address some, but not all of those competency requirements. We have webinars that review the requirements of the standard. We have webinars that review root cause and corrective action. We have webinars on process mapping and process-based internal auditing. Any of those, Alan, may help satisfy some of the competency requirements, but not necessarily all. Again, where most organizations fail is to identify what those requirements are. And then you can fulfill those requirements in a variety of different ways, training being just one of them. Self-study, previous work experience may suffice, but you need to document what those are and then how the person satisfied them. And what's often lacking is the documenting of what they are and an indication as to how they're satisfied. Training certificates in a file do not suffice. We need to see a documentation of what's required. The requirements related to auditor competency need to be documented somewhere. It can be on its own standalone document. It can be part of an internal audit procedure. It could be part of a training procedure. It could be in a job description. Could be anywhere. They just need to be documented. A matrix. Someone's asking, I've been a certified ISO 9001-2008 lead auditor for over 5 years. Do I require more evidence of competence other than my past experience in 2008 certification? This particular individual, based on their prior experience, probably knows how to conduct an audit, compile an audit report, review the adequacy of corrective actions. I would think you may need some supplemental training or self-study on the requirements of the new versions of the standard, but everything else should remain unchanged. Somebody's saying, are the requirements for internal auditor competency for the lead auditor along with any fellow auditors he or she has helping? Absolutely. You have to define competency requirements for all internal auditors. If in your organization you have a lead internal auditor designation and an auditor designation, there may be different competency requirements for each designation. But every internal auditor has to have competency requirements defined, just like any other position affecting quality. Somebody's asking if there's a webinar on how to determine and monitor quality metrics. The closest one to this, Joe, is our webinar on processes and process-based internal audits. We talk about what's an example of a good quality objective versus one that's not so good. But definitely something we can consider developing for the future. Somebody's asking us, how often is the internal audit outsourced? Every organization has to make their own business decision for this. Sometimes people choose to outsource their internal audit to an individual or a consulting agency. That's fine. You'll want to make sure that that individual or consulting agency follows your internal audit procedure, uses your documents, and that you have evidence of their competency. And you need to maintain this as part of your management system. If you choose to do your internal audit in-house, remember, people can't audit their own work. Again, whether or not you outsource it is entirely your business decision. We don't provide a basic template for conducting an internal audit. We have to be very careful about doing that, as we can't consult. And providing a method would be consulting. Again, we're always looking for ideas on future webinars. Anything you would like to see covered, would be welcomed. Wait a few more minutes to see if any other questions come in. Yep, great question, Alan, because an internal auditor cannot audit his or her own work. The internal audit process needs to be audited by another individual. That is correct. And again, Fred, you can use your own internal resources to conduct internal audits, or you can outsource it to a third party. Remember my caution about outsourcing audits to a third party. They have to use your system, and you have to maintain records of their competency. Would a business owner who's been ISO 9001 certified be an experienced internal auditor? Just working in an organization or owning an organization that's been certified very likely does not make that person an experienced internal auditor. And that's because I think that owning a business that's certified isn't an adequate competency requirement. A lot of organizations are certified and the owner isn't really in tune with the ins and outs of the requirements of the standard. They may not have training and audit technique. So that in and of itself is highly unlikely to make them an experienced internal auditor, Jody, regardless of the size of the company. Again, if they have previous experience with the requirements, they really understand them, and you can demonstrate that they understand them, you can demonstrate that they understand audit techniques, then maybe. But that in and of itself is highly unlikely. Getting a question to explain the difference between a major and minor nonconformity. A major nonconformity, the definition is going to differ depending on the standard, but it's a total breakdown in a requirement, a total failure, or an increased likelihood of shipping suspect or nonconforming product to the customer. A minor nonconformity is really just a one-off or a temporary lapse in a single requirement. PJR does not provide any lead auditor training. We do have a sister company, PJI, that provides some lead auditor and internal auditor training. They're a great source, but there are many other sources out there, and a quick web search will reveal a number of both on-site, in-person courses and virtual training sources. Chris, I think you have an excellent suggestion. If a company has more than one site, could auditors from site A internally audit the processes at site B and vice versa? Absolutely. We'll wait another minute or so to see if any other questions come in. Please don't be shy. And again, the presentation itself and a digital recording of today's presentation will be available at pjr.com about 24 to 48 hours from right now. Somebody's asking, how is an OFI, which is the abbreviation from an opportunity for improvement, different from a nonconformity observed during an internal audit? My answer is going to be the same, whether it's an internal audit or a third-party audit conducted by a certification body, and it's very simple. A nonconformity is a non-fulfillment of a requirement. You're not meeting a requirement of the standard. In an opportunity for improvement, you are conforming to the standard, but an auditor has the insight or perspective to maybe suggest that there could be some improvement in the area, but you are still conforming. If you are non-conforming, it's automatically a non-conformity. You mentioned non-conformance is due to a difference in quality language. Will the non-conformance still be documented if the process is in fact conforming? No, it won't. I mean, our auditors may think they have a finding, but upon further investigation, they find evidence of conformity, and we realize that perhaps the person didn't understand the question due to a difference in quality language. But if in fact the situation's conforming, we won't document a nonconformity. only if, after investigation, if the situation is non-conforming, will we document it as such. We'll wait just a few more minutes. Questions seem to keep trickling in. Somebody's saying a question about an internal auditor cannot audit his own work. How is the person's work categorized so management knows who should not be auditing? It's really quite simple. If you are, reviewing and approving purchase orders, you can't audit that. If you did last year's internal audit, you can't do the audit of internal auditing next year. You can't audit your own work. You won't be objective, you'll be biased. You've got to audit other people's work, other people's areas, other people's disciplines. And the more separation, the better. If we have two auditors, but only one owns the audit procedure, I'm assuming you mean internal audit procedure, Jessica. Can the other one audit the procedure? Remember, we're not auditing procedures. You should be auditing processes. I'm assuming you meant processes. Auditors can't audit their own work. I don't know. I need to be really careful here. So if they're auditing the internal audit, I suppose if the other person is pulling together the plan and the schedule and reviewing the corrective action responses, potentially that could work. You have to be really careful. People can't audit their own work. We will likely offer this webinar at a later date, probably sometime toward the end of first quarter 2018, Patty. Not a lot of prepared content with this one, but we do get a lot of good questions. Okay, folks, it appears that those are all the questions we have today. I thank you for your time today. Have a great holiday.